In early 1927, the Mississippi River became the site of the most destructive river flood in U.S. history, submerging 27,000 square miles of land beneath up to 30 feet of water. In today's economy, the damage would cost nearly $1.5 trillion. This diagram shows a cross-section of the Mississippi River being compressed by steep levees, massive earthen walls built to contain the water. In the late 19th century, the federal government adopted a strict levee-only policy to control the flow and boost commerce. They ignored engineers who warned that squeezing a swollen river between artificial walls would only multiply its destructive force. The breaking point arrived after months of record rainfall. Unable to expand naturally, the highly pressurized river obliterated these earthen levees in 145 distinct locations. The physical floodwaters eventually receded. Yet the displacement of over 630,000 people meant that hundreds of thousands of families would never return to their previous lives. 94% of those displaced by the rising water lived in Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The vast majority were Black agricultural workers who supplied the labor force for the Delta lowlands. As the surrounding farmland vanished, thousands of people were stranded on the narrow, unbroken stretches of the levees. In Greenville, Mississippi, over 13,000 evacuees were trapped on a single levee crest for days without access to food or clean water. The scale of the displacement exposed a rigid racial hierarchy, as the Delta's existing social order dictated who received help and who was left on the levees. As the destruction moved downstream, the wealthy elite of New Orleans grew desperate. On Good Friday, 15 inches of local rain overwhelmed the city's pumping system, flooding streets and convincing influential bankers that the approaching river crest would destroy their city. This map tracks the intentional diversion of water away from New Orleans. To guarantee the safety of their assets, a group of businessmen arranged to detonate 30 tons of dynamite on the Carnarvon levee, releasing 250,000 cubic feet of water per second out of the river channel. The water poured directly into the neighboring St. Bernard and Plaquemines parishes. This preemptive strike devastated these poorer communities. To make matters worse, several major levees broke upstream the very next day, meaning the New Orleans demolition had been completely unnecessary. The bankers refused to compensate the downriver victims for their losses. The floodwaters were weaponized by the elite. In a crisis, the existing power structures actively sacrificed marginalized communities to preserve their own wealth. To manage the hundreds of thousands of displaced citizens, the federal government established massive tent cities. The relief effort was placed under the direction of the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover. Of the 325,000 people who occupied these relief camps, 69% were African American. Inside the camps, racial inequality was strictly enforced. White citizens were given priority for evacuation and essential supplies. Black evacuees received the leftovers and were denied basic rations unless they could provide the name of a white employer. The administration also enforced involuntary servitude. Black citizens were prevented from leaving the camps and forced to work against their will. When individuals resisted, hostilities erupted. In Arkansas, a Black man named Owen Fleming was lynched after refusing to rescue a plantation owner's mules. In another camp, a police officer shot and killed a Black man for refusing to unload a relief boat at gunpoint. These federal relief camps functioned as forced labor holding pens. For Black Americans in the South, the experience destroyed the promise of federal protection. By August 1927, the floodwaters finally began to subside. Tens of thousands of displaced Black Americans now faced a choice about where to rebuild. Having endured the forced labor conditions of the relief camps, many individuals refused to return to the oppressive rural agricultural system. With their crops already destroyed, they began looking for a way out of the Delta entirely. This map shows migration vectors flowing outward from the flooded Delta states. Displaced families directed their movement up into northern industrial hubs, particularly Chicago. This accelerated an existing demographic shift, as hundreds of thousands more followed the 1927 refugees. The flood physically severed the bind holding the Black labor force to the southern soil, shifting the demographic and cultural center of Black America to the industrial north. The massive flood redefined political careers. Herbert Hoover leveraged his reputation for crisis management to win the 1928 presidential election. But the victory cost him a crucial voting bloc. Hoover had actively suppressed reports of the terrible conditions in the refugee camps and ultimately broken his promises of reform. In response, influential Black leaders strongly encouraged their communities to abandon the Republican Party and align with the National Democrats. In Louisiana, the fallout was equally severe. Working-class farmers directed their fury at the New Orleans elite, who had intentionally flooded their land. This rural anger fueled the 1928 populist election of Governor Huey Long. Congress eventually passed the Flood Control Act of 1928, directing the Army Corps of Engineers to build the world's longest system of levees and floodways to try and contain the river. The government built a new physical system to contain the river, but by the time the concrete was poured, the mismanagement of the relief effort had already redirected the country's migration patterns, altered its political loyalties, and transformed racial dynamics.